Operation Sindoor has undoubtedly been the global talking point. But has India won the narrative? Joining us on this special podcast is Mr. John Spencer. He is the chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. And in fact, Mr. Spencer was here in India in the last few weeks, interacting with a cross-section of people, particularly within the armed forces. Thank you very much, Mr. Spencer, for joining us on this broadcast. Let me straight away begin by asking you, your time in India, when you have been interacting with several high-level army professionals as well as those in the Navy, I want to get an understanding from you as to what is it that you have been able to take from here, because many would say that Operation Sindoor today is one of the classic example of modern warfare. What is it that you've been able to pick up from the various meetings that you've had in the national capital?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I've learned a lot, and I'm still basically piecing together those connections. As somebody who studies war around the world, I've learned that there's just something you can't get from going and visiting, interviewing senior military and civilian leadership, but also even in industries that were a part of the Make in India, self-reliant India, which were years in the making. So I understand more enough to know that Operation Sindoor was an output of actions that were happening weeks, months, and years before the awful terrorist attack in Pahalgam. So interviewing some of the senior military leaders, I learned about a lot of those initiatives to change the military, to do rehearsals for worst case scenarios. Militaries do a lot of planning. So I learned about that. I learned even from retired senior Indian military officers about the history of prior operations, because a part of my research has been also what is different this time. How does this, as some people know, I've been on the ground studying like the 2008 Mumbai attacks and the lack of response. It was more of a diplomatic response. How has the culture, strategic culture, politically but also militarily, changed within the Indian military that led to such a dominant performance of the Indian military in my analysis in Operation Sindoor? So I learned a lot of these kind of different aspects of different technologies, different changes in culture, but really ultimately from the military, what you get is that I know enough about war that there isn't one system, although there are lots of systems that are very impressive. The BrahMos, Akash, so many strike for the Sky Striker, like all these different bits and pieces. But I know that it was India's integration. So the synchronization of the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force was really what we call the PhD level of warfighting that I got from the military. So, well, how did you do that? How did you work so seamlessly with every other service in both defense but also offense, which I know some more to the details that's not easy to do.
Can I then ask you, since you say that this was a kind of a comparative study that you've essentially done, the response that came in post the Mumbai attacks versus various other terrorist attacks that have actually taken place on the Indian soil, what, in your opinion, after careful understanding of the situation, what is it that you have been able to establish so far?
So far, one is that this was a complete shift comparatively to the response. India in 2008 went to the international community. In this case, India showed strategic independence, saying not only will we respond immediately, but we'll respond with military action because of how overwhelming this attack was. India attacked very constrained, but very precision and dominantly 9 terrorist sites in Pakistan, a direct retribution for the terrorist attack, and then communicated it immediately, which is also part of my study, is just that element in the modern wars, how important that strategic communication. I'm sure we'll talk about narratives, but strategic communications, when you saw Indian, both political and military leaders communicating on the same sheet of music, that what the response and why they responded, but also bringing the data. My research, I'm always looking for the data, right? In God I trust, all others bring data. And if you look at just comparatively in this operation, you can go back to 2008, but just between Pakistan and India, comparatively, on who was putting out information, both were having press conferences. India was providing video, satellite imagery, everything of exactly what they hit and why. And Pakistan was just presenting words and saying they did a lot, but with no evidence. So there's a comparative analysis. But from the kind of strategic response, the Prime Minister's immediate comments was unique. Not only were they very clear, but they were bold, as in, we are not the same India. Strategically, India will respond immediately to any terrorist attack. The blood in the water, the two-faced game of Pakistan, but also mentioning the no longer the nuclear blackmail. That was a significant change from a new India saying, look, nobody wants reckless military escalation, but we will not cower to the nuclear threats, which is reckless, and they will respond very deliberately. So every level, there's a difference between India 2008, India today. But I'm also trying to find all the threads on why, to include why the terrorist attack happened, even the investments in Jammu and Kashmir that India has done to increase tourism and everything, which are some of these underlying reasons on why did this happen, why now, part of the study.
Talking specifically about Operation Sindoor itself, while covering it, I personally felt that this by far has been a classic example of what I call a modern warfare done in the best possible manner. Clinical precision attacks that have actually taken place. Hence, I want to ask you this. What do you make of the operation itself? The fact that they were able to respond, India was able to respond quickly. India was able to carry out an attack without inflicting much casualties in terms of civilian damages. You can contrast that. But first, I want to ask you about what do you make of the operation in itself?
I agree. So in 4 days, the ability to achieve so many strategic goals. War is the pursuit of strategic objectives. So when the strategic apparatus, the political governance, and especially in a democracy, has to articulate what are the objectives. So the objective is to immediately establish deterrence, signal a new strategic doctrine, what India did. And then the only way, deterrence only works if you have the capability and the will to do it. India clearly demonstrated the will to do it in the politically. Militarily, like we're talking about, every element of military dominance was shown. Even not just in offensive, to hit what they wanted when they wanted. So India was able to hit those 9 terrorist strikes, and then when Pakistan escalated, the 11 military targets ranging very far into Pakistan, really to anywhere they wanted. That's a level of dominance that's hard to achieve and demonstrate. So no words, just demonstration of capability, but also showing restraint. There's no perfect military operation, but at not a single. It's hard to determine, in war, there's always lessons. So India, of course, learned lessons within its military, and that's what a military will do, how to do even better next time. But even defensively, what India was able to do. So I talk a lot offensively because that does matter in deterrence, but India was able to stop hundreds of drones and missiles that Pakistan sent. And that level of dominance defensively really plays into more also assessing this 4-day operation in the demonstration of clarity between the military and everything. You're right. This is a demonstration of why I had to get to India to study this, because I think that the world kind of moved on. Modern warfare against 2 nuclear armed nations, but also constrained and limited in the objectives of the goal. And this is where you get in wars, like one camp of people is like, you got to go now, you got to do more, where you have to look to what are the objectives of the war. India was attacked, India responded, showed dominance, showed a new strategic doctrine, actually showing what we call strength through, peace through strength. Every aspect, we can talk about the tactical to the strategic, but I think it's a demonstration of absolute overwhelming success by one military to achieve strategic goals. And then the other side does a lot of talking about winning, but there's no evidence of that.
despite the kind of evidence that was put out by India before the world, there were many questions that were essentially being asked by the Western media in particular. Having said that, what many missed out is that this time India did not have to put out much evidence. Pakistan did it for themselves. The fact that their terror hubs were basically completely dismantled. But despite that, what we have seen as a response really coming in, many would say, many experts have indicated or expressed their displeasure. They were not really happy with the kind of response that came in from the Western world in particular. Many would say that why really care about how the Western world really looks at it? But having said that, it does matter when not enough is actually being done to stop Pakistan from harboring terrorists. Not enough pressure is also put on Pakistan to ensure that this terror factories that are operating comes to a grinding halt.
Yeah, it is definitely a question that people need to continue asking. I asked a question, of course, during the operation. What was the Western media covering? Seeing the trees through the woods, talking about so many number of Indian jets supposedly shot down, and that became like one of the main stories, which is confusing not just to, I'm sure, Indian, but confusing to us who study war objectively. There's a narrative part of it. You're right, when the story isn't, well, why are there so many terrorist groups backed by Pakistan, ISI, the generals themselves, so many different terrorist organizations, clearly in full visibility of the world, training camps, logistics hubs, bases for the sole purpose of launching terrorism against India and other countries. And why is that escaping kind of the Western media world is a great question. But I do believe we live in a different world. So this is where I've gotten to include in Indian media, like why doesn't the world cover this? Why does the United States do that? Why does it do this? It's hard to answer, but I do believe in studying everything that clearly we're living in a different world since, even the U.S. administration, since the awful attacks of October 7th in Israel. Now we have it in Iran. Geopolitics is complex. The war against terrorism should not be, and every bit of the clear evidence should be presented, but strategic policies changed. Clearly, India is not the same India as even since 2019. That's important. But you see the rest of the world as well. So this is where you see these geopolitical shifts, even in the trade agreements, which I'm very hopeful for India, the United States, and other countries, Israel, others, as you see this shift towards against terrorism and then exclusion, condemnation, and cost to those who not only support terrorism, but actually state-backed terrorism, as we see in Pakistan.
If I may ask you, Mr. Spencer, because you've done a detailed study of Operation Sindoor, what is that one thing perhaps that really fascinated you, for you to come all the way from United States of America, coming to Delhi, meeting a cross-section of people, and after this, is there one single aspect of the operation that you find extremely fascinating?
Now, that's a really hard question because I learned so many elements that were fascinating. I will say, I mean, if you force me to, the defense reforms. As somebody who's served 25 years in the U.S. military, now studying for a decade, advising in the Pentagon, the defense reforms that India, the nation of India, has made to unleash the power of innovation within the people of India, from data, artificial intelligence, drones, defensive capabilities. That one is fascinating that in a short amount of time, so like 5 years, India has put itself on a self-reliance where they were 70% reliant on foreign investment of technologies, military technologies, to where they're getting close to zero in some capabilities. That level of shift, 5 years, 7 years shift within the defense reform of India is fascinating and I think undercovered, where you have military technologies, even in lasers. India may soon be the leading producer of a laser that can take away this dominant process of the cheap drones on the battlefield. But those defense reforms for me were, and being in India, talking to the political, military, and civilian aspects of that is fascinating.
I want to also now focus a little bit about the response that came in from the Pakistanis. While there was no evidence that was put out by the Pakistanis, many believe, or there is a presumption that many have, that as far as the information warfare is concerned, did the Pakistanis have any sort of an edge?
It's a good question. You have to look at what were the main sources of information that had the most impact. So whether that was in social media or we call mainstream media and stories in like New York Times and others, who was behind those? Like what dedicated journalist who understands the region, understands the aspects, can see through the fog. I find often that, of course, if there's a story that's sticking, and we live in a world where if there's a story that's sticking, that if a country also communicates, but he has to counterbalance that story that's sticking. So that's why I really think the two different press conferences are fascinating, where Pakistan makes a press conference saying we hit all of these things and knock down all of these things, but we're not going to provide any evidence. And then the media goes searching for that evidence, and they can't find it even with using civilian satellite imagery. But for some reason, a story sticks to the point where it's almost within the popular opinion that happened, despite there not being any evidence. That's a part of the analysis, the post-Operation Sindoor, that still needs to be done at a very high level. Is the communication was historic that India was doing. But in this world of ubiquitous instant information, could you have fought these things that were clearly false? Like some countries take a point of like, I'm not going to address that. That's crazy. There's no evidence of that. But in the world we live in, where it is a contest of wills, even within media and populations, you do have to be responsive to address a story that's sticking. Where I think the truth still matters, but again, the evidence. One side is presenting no evidence. One side is presenting all the evidence. But for some reason, the popular opinion is the opposite. And I think that's a challenge for India and for all nations to deal with this new information domain. It's always been there, but it's completely changed. It's not the same.
You also make a mention of the fact that after speaking to several of the officials here in India, there are certain challenges that have now come up. Challenges in terms of infiltration attempts, etc. What is it that you believe is the biggest concern that India has at this point in time?
What I felt, and again, and I need to do more study, especially post Sindoor, is that this operation, while setting a new strategic doctrine for India, demonstrating the capability, although the military definitely recognizes that you can't rest on your past performances. You have to be ready for new threats, like you said, the infiltration zone, the counterterrorism zone, preventing, increasing active defense. But I think at the strategic level is not to let, like the terrorists wanted to derail the development goals, not just in Jammu and Kashmir, but in India in general. India has, and this is what I learned, some very big goals from the data, AI, the continued of the defense reforms. The big concern is not letting your past successes dominate your present actions, but also not derailing the developments and the strength and power that India's glide path puts it on. And what I was learning about and just consumed by is all the different initiatives that India has right now, from the data, the AI, even the military, and not letting this derail that, while not also learning the lessons. There are lessons here for India to improve on, that are India's itself to do. But I think the big concern is that not to derail all these massive development goals that India has.
Can I also then perhaps draw your attention to the other important aspect, that is the strategic goal of any particular operation? You believe that yes, the strategic goal of Operation Sindoor was met because you were essentially looking at those 7 locations where We've seen a targeted response really coming in. But do you believe that this is the end of it, or this is perhaps the beginning of a new age war in this region?
I don't think so that I personally believe only the dead have seen the end of war, but this is where you have to convince a lot of people in my world, even in academia, that the way you prevent wars is through this type of operation like Operation Sindoor, which is signaling strength. I mean, deterrence, like I said, is only achieved through two ways. One, having the capability, dominance, but also the will to use it. So I do think this is a new era. We've entered a new era. Do I think it's the end of an era? Do I think this is going to completely deter Pakistan from backing terrorism and continuing to try to use terrorism in a proxy way? No. But it is a signal of strength that wasn't as clear, but it also requires continued investments and continued work to keep the level of deterrence that you've now established, right? So this goes to even protecting new areas in India, because the age of longer range systems, what used to be a factor within the line of control, or what systems could range where, that you will have to have both the strategic dominance. So this is continued investments from stealth fighters to defensive capabilities, but also defending cities and defending areas in India that may not have been, previously thought of needing defensive capability, not for hopefully no attack, but in order to have deterrence, you have to have capability and the will to use it. So that's a big concern. Do I think this is mean increased instability? No, because through deterrence and then through development, this is where a school of thought, and there are oppositions to it, that you achieve a longer lasting peace. Even if the other side wants to harm you, the costs to them are so great. And this is why this shift in the strategic doctrine, I don't want Operation Sindoor for people in the world to miss what it was. Of course, it was a very precise, restrained military dominance, but it was a strategic shift, a change. Now you have to see what the results of that change will be going forward.
One final question, Mr. Spencer, before I let you go, in terms of the overall picture that emerges from this. And I'm asking this question once again because many believe that if there is one area that India hasn't been able to capitalize, is the area of information warfare. And it stems from the fact that despite having this kind of evidence on the ground, we haven't been able to drive that home. And all of this discussion was about whether at all India had lost its fighter jets or not, because it's a combat situation. Even if we had lost any fighter jet, the reality is this, that it is a combat. And at the end of the day, if we have met with our strategic goals, then why should that be a problem? With that logic in mind, one would have settled the debate. It seems it remains completely unsettled even now.
You're right, and I agree. And this is why I think one of my motivations was, and I faced this in other wars, like how can that be the story? How can all of these elements that we've talked about right now, in the last few minutes, not be the story? And for some reason, that being the one story is very concerning. But you're right. For India's sake, is like, who are you communicating to? I mean, the great work that your station did and other stations did to try to communicate to the outside world. We live in a globalized, connected world, and some governments have adapted to that and how they put out narratives through different mediums. And this is where even the social media aspect, we live in a world of distrust of institutions. So then you have influencers and you have stories that stick, and then the algorithm is really driving. I think this is a big part of why did that story stick? Because, well, you do some forensics on when did it start, how did it spread, who amplified it, to include the mainstream media who view it only as a clickbait story, as in, look, this is spreading in these different buckets, so we're going to amplify it just for the monetizing of the story, even though we even know that the evidence trained, the journalistic standards aren't there for proof and fact checking. But we live in this world of who tells the story first, who tells keeps the story going. India has to work within that and decide how to do the forensics of what happened and why did that become the story. There are many data points and crumbs along that point, but this is the future where you have to have credibility, right? So this is India's credibility and what it's saying and the evidence it's bringing, which was very unique, but also the capability. So in information warfare, you have to have the capability to get information that is viewed as credible out into these different segments, to include even in social media in different speaking languages where the algorithm picks it up. And no matter what you say, it just can't overcome the noise of what's being said, which is a challenge. And I think India needs to take a hard look at what happened and like how could that be the story that the great parts of the world ran with.
John, I can't let you go without asking you this question because when I declared that you would be joining us on this podcast, many ended up asking me this, that you must ask this question because he's met one of the topmost high-ranking officials in the Indian Army, and everyone wants to know the inside story of it. What is it that perhaps the Indian audience also does not know, and John Spencer really knows about Operation Sindoor? And I'm sure you could perhaps put this into perspective and reveal a little bit more than what you've revealed so far. What is it that India and the world does not know, and perhaps John Spencer can reveal tonight?
I will say that in looking at war, everything seems simple. I understand from ancient warfare till now is that even the simple can be complex in warfare. So from meeting with Indians' top military personnel, I didn't understand the level of work, the war gaming, the active defensive training, all of that was going on behind the scenes, basically not sleeping since the terrorist attack till the success in Operation Sindoor. You had hundreds and thousands of senior Indian military who weren't sleeping because they were going over second, third order effects and preparation. And I'm a military man, so I understand some of that, but I couldn't have fathomed that level of daily decisions, decision making, planning for the second, third order possibilities of the enemy's response or the preparations needed to stop attacks. I think that level, maybe some people in India understand, but from my meetings, I took that away as something that other people really just can't understand, is the level of work that was happening behind the scenes, to include, when you see it on TV, even the press conferences, how much work was happening, but even the military actions to prevent disasters that was happening.
Well, thank you very much, John, for joining us on this podcast. We're really hoping that we will connect once again, as here the military establishment says that Operation Sindoor is far from over.
True. Thanks for having me.